Behind the image of the indestructible leader projected by propaganda, there was hidden a fragile, sick and dependent man. His daily life was crossed by diagnoses, injections and mysterious pills that kept him standing while the Reich collapsed. The story of his doctors, of the treatments he received, and of the clinical secrets that surrounded his figure reveals an intimate and hidden portrait of the most feared dictator of the 20th century. Absolute medical dependence. In the very heart of the Reich Chancellery, among walls covered with maps, military orders and strict schedules, there existed a reserved space that did not respond to the logic of strategy nor to the pulse of the general staff. It was the room where bottles, boxes, ampoules and syringes were stored, an improvised pharmaceutical cabinet from which Adolf Hitler never separated himself. Since his youth, he had developed an almost obsessive attachment to remedies, a constant fear of illnesses, and a blind trust in any substance that promised immediate relief. That hypochondriac trait, seemingly minor, would become one of the central elements of his private life and, in the long run, a determining factor in his behavior as a political leader. The image of the Führer, spread by propaganda, was that of a healthy, energetic, almost ascetic man. The newsreels showed him vigorous, upright, able to speak for entire hours without resting, an example of discipline and strength. But behind that carefully designed construction, the reality was very different. Hitler was a chronic patient, subjected to a regime of treatments that chained him to the judgment of his doctors and to the promise of each pill. The myth of the man of iron contrasted with the fragility of the body that could barely sustain him without chemical help. Already in the 1930s, before the war, Hitler always traveled accompanied by a personal medicine chest. It was a small leather case prepared with extreme care, where medications of all kinds piled up: digestive pills, painkillers, herbal tonics, eye drops, essential oils. It was not unusual for him to stop in the middle of a conversation to take out a bottle and swallow tablets with a sip of mineral water. His companions were used to that gesture and hardly commented on it. The remarkable thing is that he did not trust a single remedy. He needed many, and he needed to have them at hand at all times, as if his very life depended on that traveling pharmacy. The arrival of Theodor Morell to his circle in 1936 did nothing more than institutionalize what was already a habit. Hitler found in that corpulent, sweaty doctor with coarse manners someone willing to reinforce his conviction that his organism was fragile and that it could only be sustained through a constant administration of substances. What before was a private habit became a regulated system, with schedules, doses and protocols designed to fit his anxiety. The dependence ceased to be discreet. It became the very routine of the Führer. The testimonies of his secretaries are revealing. One of them remembered that in the first years barely a small bottle appeared on the table, an occasional dose to relieve stomach discomfort. But with the passage of time, the number multiplied until it filled an entire briefcase. Each meal was accompanied by tablets, each dawn by injections. Hitler could begin a meeting with the general staff speaking of offensives in the east and suddenly interrupt himself to call Morell and demand a new dose of his miracle drops. The tone of urgency with which he asked for them and the calm he showed as soon as he received them make it clear that the relationship with medicine had ceased to be preventive. It was addictive in the psychological sense of the word. Morell himself knew how to take advantage of that trait. When he was introduced into the Chancellery, he did not have the prestige of other personal doctors, nor the elegance of court physicians. However, Hitler supported him against all odds, even when everyone around despised him for his careless appearance and his tendency to doze during meetings. The key was simple. Morell offered him immediate relief. A single injection was enough for the fatigue to dissipate, a pill for the stomach pangs to yield. Hitler felt it in his own body, and that direct experience was worth more than any elaborate diagnosis. Thus was established a bond of absolute trust. The Führer could not imagine his life without the assistance of that doctor. Medical dependence extended to all aspects of his routine. Meals were regulated with obsession. Hitler, a declared vegetarian, followed strict diets that changed according to his frequent and painful intestinal discomforts. Morell imposed lists of prohibitions, removed certain foods, incorporated others, and complemented everything with capsules of enzymes, intestinal bacteria, and supposedly natural tonics. The result was that each lunch became a chemical operation in which nothing was left to chance. Hitler himself spoke of his menus as if they were part of a hospital treatment. The nights were even more revealing. Insomnia harassed him constantly. While the rest of the Reich slept, the Führer walked through the corridors of the Chancellery, surrounded by exhausted aides who could barely keep pace with him. To combat the endless wakefulness, he resorted to sedatives and sleeping pills. When the effects dissipated too soon, he asked for reinforcements. When they left him dazed upon waking, he demanded new formulas. In that vicious circle, dependence on medications deepened day after day. There was no dawn without Hitler commenting with Morell on the balance of the night, what worked, what failed, what should be adjusted for the next dose. The war accentuated that sickly relationship. The rhythm of operations, unexpected defeats, and the tensions of command led him to multiply the consultations. Morell's diaries reveal an endless catalogue of injections applied in the middle of strategic meetings, during trips in armoured trains, or in the very frontline headquarters. Hitler surrendered without hesitation. He rolled up his sleeve, exposed the vein, and let the needle penetrate. He did not ask about the composition of the liquids, he only wanted to feel the immediate relief. The stomach pain, the acidity, the dizziness, the fatigue, everything seemed to dissipate after each injection. And when that did not happen, the frustration was so intense that Hitler unleashed his fury on his surroundings, convinced that his organism was betraying him. His collaborators began to notice that there no longer existed Hitler without Morell. The doctor became an inseparable figure, present in each transfer, in each day. He was the first to be called at the slightest discomfort and the last to leave after administering the nightly doses. On occasion, high-ranking officers tried to remove him, arguing that his methods were dangerous. Karl Brandt, for example, accused him of slowly poisoning the Führer, but Hitler did not tolerate criticism. When someone questioned Morell's ability, he responded harshly, "He has cured me when no one else could do it." That phrase was enough to close any debate. The result was that medical dependence not only affected his body but also the structure of power. No one could challenge Morell without challenging the Führer himself. The routine of injections reached unusual dimensions. The records show that toward the last years of the war, Hitler received several injections daily, in addition to dozens of pills. His arms were covered with scars, and Morell had difficulties finding free veins. However, the Führer demanded to go on. He could not conceive passing a day without that chemical help. In his mind, the drugs were part of the machinery that sustained the Third Reich, as necessary as tanks or airplanes. If the generals planned offensives, he planned his medication regime. This level of dependence came to affect his relationship with time. Hitler measured the days not in hours nor in military events, but in intervals between one injection and the next. If he had to attend a conference with his generals, he first asked how long until the dose that would keep him standing during the meeting. If he had to receive a foreign ambassador, he calculated the prior administration of tonics to appear energetic. The chronology of his life was marked by the clock of medicine. The perception of himself as a permanent patient also isolated him from others. While the soldiers at the front dealt with wounds and hardships without any type of care, he surrounded himself with doctors and bottles. That difference fueled the distance from reality, reinforcing the idea that his body was a unique, irreplaceable instrument that had to be preserved at any cost. It was no longer about health, but about a cult of his own figure, sustained by the needle and the pill. In that logic, absolute medical dependence became inseparable from the identity of the Führer in his last years. Without his medications, he did not recognize himself. With them, he believed he regained strength, even if only for a few hours. The circle was perfect. The weaker he felt, the more he needed Morell. The more he trusted Morell, the weaker he became without him. Medicine ceased to be auxiliary to become the backbone of his daily existence. Experimental and dangerous treatments. The body of Adolf Hitler was transformed during the war into a living laboratory. The absolute dependence into which he had fallen opened the door to a much more risky terrain, uncontrolled medical experimentation. Theodor Morell, his personal doctor, moved between improvisation and opportunism. Wherever conventional medicine did not offer immediate results, he introduced secret formulas, glandular extracts and cocktails of substances that bordered on the frontier between the therapeutic and the toxic. Hitler, confident that each injection kept him on his feet, never questioned the origin or the composition of the liquids that entered his veins. The result was a regime of treatments whose danger could only be assessed with time. Morell's diaries offer a chilling panorama. They record mixtures of vitamins with compounds of animal origin, bacterial suspensions intended to reinforce the intestinal flora, and glandular extracts that promised to revitalize fatigued organs. The variety was so wide that the doctors in the circle themselves could not understand what exactly the Führer was receiving. Many of the bottles lacked clear labels, and Morell's notes were limited to indecipherable abbreviations, as if even inside the chancellery he feared revealing too much. The officers who observed these practices spoke of a chemical arsenal that grew daily on Hitler's night table. One of the most recurrent substances was vitamultin, a supposedly vitamin preparation that included liver extracts, calcium, and, on occasions, derivatives of animal hormones. Each injection promised instant energy. Hitler usually rose after receiving it with the sensation that exhaustion disappeared as if by magic. But the more critical doctors warned that this revitalization was nothing more than a mirage, a fleeting stimulation that in the long run could wear down his nervous and cardiovascular system. Karl Brandt, trusted surgeon and declared rival of Morell, went so far as to affirm that these practices were turning a relatively healthy man into a chemical invalid. No less controversial was the use of strychnine and atropine in the so-called anti-gas pills, originally designed as a preventive measure against chemical attacks. Hitler consumed them frequently, convinced that they relieved his digestion and reinforced his resistance. Strychnine, in minimal doses, could generate nervous stimulation. In excess, it was a lethal poison. Atropine, for its part, altered heart rate and vision. The combination was dangerous even for sporadic use, and nevertheless the Führer ingested it as part of his routine. It was a perfect example of how the frontier between medicine and poison became blurred in his case. The treatment of nasal ailments offers another revealing chapter. Hitler suffered from chronic sinusitis, and to relieve it, Morell applied solutions with cocaine. In small amounts, the substance acted as a local anesthetic, reducing congestion and pain. But repetition of the doses generated a fleeting sense of euphoria and, over time, a clear inclination toward abuse. He was not a classic addict, as some doctors pointed out, but he was someone who found pleasure in the effects of those applications. Cocaine not only relieved, but also reinforced the illusion of energy, the same that Hitler constantly sought in each bottle. Among the most extravagant compounds were glandular extracts. Morell firmly believed that vitality could be transmitted from an animal organ to a human being. He prepared suspensions of bovine, pancreatic, or testicular glands and injected them with the conviction that they would reinforce Hitler's weakened functions. These practices, common in certain medical circles of the early 20th century, lacked real evidence and could trigger severe immunological reactions. Nevertheless, Hitler submitted to them docilely, convinced that each injection brought him closer to the immortality that his followers attributed to his figure. Bacteria were also part of this experimental universe. Morell cultivated intestinal strains and administered them as primitive probiotics. His intention was to balance the Führer's digestive flora, always afflicted by pain and flatulence. But the results were uncertain. Sometimes the cocktails generated temporary relief, and at other times they produced violent diarrhea. The medical record is full of episodes in which Hitler had to suspend meetings due to intestinal crises, despite the preventive injections. The remedy, far from curing, seemed to exacerbate the problem. Suspicions about the use of Pervitin, an amphetamine derivative widely used by German soldiers to endure long marches, also add to the list. Although Morell's diaries do not offer conclusive proof, there are records of prescriptions issued in Berlin pharmacies for this stimulant. Pervitin generated a sense of alertness and energy, but its prolonged consumption led to dependence and physical deterioration. Some general staff officers claimed that they had seen Hitler pass from a state of extreme dejection to sudden euphoria after receiving an injection, which fueled suspicions that Morell was secretly using these kinds of compounds. The cumulative effects of this pharmacopoeia were evident. Hitler suffered tremors in his hands, sudden mood swings, and a visible deterioration of his physical appearance. The photographs of the last years show a haggard face with sallow skin and a clumsy gait. His arms were covered with scars from so many injections, and on occasions Morell had to look for new points of access because the veins were hardened. The doctor himself admitted in private the difficulty of continuing to find places where to introduce the needle without risk of collapse. The Nazi court observed with growing alarm. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Minister of Foreign Affairs, went so far as to confront Morell directly in 1943. He asked him if it was really necessary for the Führer to receive so many daily injections, and if among them there was not something more than simple glucose solutions. Morell's response was enigmatic: "I give him what he needs." That phrase, repeated with indifference, symbolized the power he had accumulated. No one but him knew the exact content of the syringes, and no one dared to question too much for fear of Hitler's fury. The idea that Morell might be slowly poisoning the dictator circulated in the corridors. Karl Brandt, when interrogated after the war, affirmed that Morell had transformed a relatively strong man into a dependent patient saturated with substances that weakened him day by day. But at the same time, he acknowledged that the situation was irreversible. Hitler trusted Morell so much that he would not accept another doctor. The paradox was clear. The most powerful man in Germany was in the hands of a mediocre doctor, sustained solely by his ability to produce immediate relief. Morell's arsenal also included traditional practices, such as the use of leeches to decompress circulatory problems or inflammations. Although they were already obsolete in conventional medicine, he applied them convinced of their effectiveness. Hitler, obsessed with his health, accepted even these archaic methods as long as they promised him some benefit. The scene of a 20th century dictator subjected to medieval therapies is as surprising as it is revealing of the level of dependence he had reached. In parallel, Morell turned his exclusive access to the Führer into a lucrative business. He founded laboratories, registered patents for medicines, and promoted them as products endorsed by Hitler's own trust. The pharmaceutical companies that collaborated with him obtained privileged contracts, and many of the substances he tested on his most famous patient were covert trials for future business. The body of the Führer was at once political battlefield and commercial platform. Each injection, each pill, each experiment fed the illusion of control. Hitler believed that his physical resistance, his ability to endure endless days, and his willpower were directly linked to Morell's treatments. In reality, that dependence plunged him more and more into a cycle of progressive weakening. The experimental and dangerous treatments became inseparable from his daily life, to the point of conditioning not only his health, but also the perception he had of himself as an indestructible leader. The myth of Patient A. In the medical documents that survived the war, Adolf Hitler rarely appears named with his real name. The figure that had concentrated absolute power in Europe, that had dictated extermination orders and decided campaigns that dragged millions to death, was recorded in clinical papers with a cold and almost bureaucratic pseudonym, Patient A. That initial, apparently innocuous, hid a set of medical histories that still today make it possible to reconstruct the fragility of a man who in public presented himself as the bearer of unbreakable strength. The archives of Theodor Morell, recovered after 1945, reveal an exhaustive, almost obsessive clinical portrait of the ailments that afflicted the Führer. Each analysis, each electrocardiogram, each note about his diet or his intestinal transit was carefully recorded. Far from the image of invulnerability projected by Reich propaganda, Patient A appears in those pages as a chronic patient, trapped in a body that weakened at an implacable pace. Digestive problems occupy a central place in this story. Hitler suffered constant flatulence, abdominal pain, and episodes of diarrhea that could last for days. These discomforts, apparently banal, came to condition his daily routine and his ability to concentrate. In Morell's records appear repeated mentions of stomach crises at critical moments of the war. During the offensive in the East, for example, the dysentery attacks forced him to remain in bed in the middle of the planning of operations. The medical history of Patient A shows that great military decisions were crossed with interruptions for enemas, soft diets, and bacterial solutions that sought, without much success, to stabilize a permanently altered digestive system. Insomnia was another constant in the life of the patient. Morell's notes show him unable to sleep without chemical help, subjected to endless cycles of wakefulness that kept him active until dawn. Hitler, who used to meet with his generals until 3 or 4 in the morning, paid for that effort with evident exhaustion the following day. The sleeping pills knocked him down for a few hours, but upon waking they left him dazed, unable to react clearly. The clinical record turns those nights into a succession of entries where the administration of pills and hypnotic doses becomes an inseparable part of the story of the Reich at war. Among the most sensitive data emerging from the documentation is the progressive cardiac deterioration. The electrocardiograms performed between 1943 and 1944 suggest signs of coronary sclerosis, a diagnosis that Morell tried to soften in his reports but that other doctors confirmed in private. Patient A lived with the constant fear that his heart would betray him at any moment. That fear translated into obsessive consultations. He asked to have his pulse taken again and again, compared the results with those he himself calculated, and demanded complementary tests. The shadow of sudden death accompanied him each day, even while he exhorted his troops or delivered endless speeches. The nervous system also showed signs of deterioration. From 1943, the tremors in the left hand became noticeable to the point of being visible in films and photographs. The medical reports speak of nervous tension crises, muscle spasms, and episodes of sudden dejection. In the cold terminology of clinical reports, the Führer appears as a man marked by progressive neurological disorders. Close witnesses, on the other hand, remembered his unhinged appearance, his hands unable to firmly hold papers, and the fixed, sometimes lost gaze of one who struggles against a body that no longer responds. The clinical documentation also reveals the appearance of hepatitis in 1944, a disease that forced him to rest for a long time at a moment when the Reich was playing its last cards on the Western Front. The inflamed liver, probably the result of excessive use of medications and glandular tonics, weakened him for weeks. The Ardennes offensive, conceived as a decisive blow against the Allies, was planned while patient A dragged chronic fatigue, nausea, and loss of appetite, medicine and war intertwined in an equation impossible to separate. The coldness of the records does not hide, however, the psychological dimension of the case. Hitler appears as a patient obsessed with his symptoms, convinced that each discomfort could be the sign of a mortal illness. Hypochondria, already present in his youth, was exacerbated under the pressure of war. Each abdominal pain became an omen, each dizziness the prelude to collapse. The doctors had to deal not only with his body but with his anxious mind, which demanded immediate explanations and instant remedies. Patient A was not a passive patient. He was an impatient commander who demanded quick solutions, unable to accept the uncertainty of a reserved diagnosis. The myth was also built around the secrecy of the documents. After the war, Morell's archives were requisitioned by the Americans and hidden for decades in military depots and classified medical libraries. When they finally came to light, the world discovered that much of the Führer's medical history had been treated as a state secret. The reason was evident, revealing that the man who had unleashed the most devastating war in history was in reality a chronic patient, subjected to experimental therapies and weakened by constant ailments, carried immense symbolic weight. Absolute power was contained in a body that was falling apart. In this context, the figure of patient A acquires an almost allegorical character. While in speeches, Hitler presented himself as the tireless leader endowed with a superhuman will, in the medical records he was described with technical terms that spoke of fragility, dyspepsia, cardiopathy, hepatic disorders, nervous crises. The dichotomy between the public and the private image reveals to what extent propaganda needed to hide the biological truth of its caudillo. The soldiers who followed him to the front would never have imagined that the man they acclaimed was, at the same time, a clinically vulnerable patient. The construction of the myth of patient A was also sustained in the way in which Morell and other doctors presented the information. The diagnoses were ambiguous, the notes often used initials or abbreviations, and many treatments were not precisely identified. That opacity fueled endless speculations. What did the injections really contain? What illnesses did the Führer hide? To what extent was his ability to command conditioned by his physical state? The lack of transparency turned each medical note into an enigma, into an incomplete trace that historians are still trying to decipher. The designation of patient A was not only a resource to preserve confidentiality. It also reflected the place that Hitler occupied in Morell's daily practice, a patient among others, although the most demanding and absorbing of all. In the archives also appear mentions of Patient B or Patient C, secondary clients of Morell's private clinic. But none required the level of attention, the quantity of resources, nor the absolute dedication that the first on the list demanded. The letter A, in this case, was not only a code, it was the mark of maximum priority. The myth was also fed by later testimonies. Some doctors captured after the war claimed that Hitler was practically incapacitated in his last years, while others minimized his ailments to highlight the strength of the leader. Between those extremes, the clinical documents remain the most objective evidence. There it is written, in faded ink, that patient A could not sustain himself without an arsenal of medications, that his heart was sick, that his nerves broke under tension, and that his stomach was a daily battlefield. The dark role of Morell. The figure of Theodor Gilbert Morell, personal physician of Adolf Hitler, has remained enveloped in a mixture of disdain, mystery, and suspicion. In the court of the Third Reich, where impeccable uniforms and rigid manners predominated, his presence was shocking. An obese man, sweaty, with reddened skin, heavy breath, and hairy hands that always seemed sticky. Despite this little honorable appearance, he was the only doctor who managed to establish himself permanently at the side of the Führer. His permanence in that closed circle in the midst of the manifest hatred he aroused among ministers, secretaries, and officers constitutes one of the most striking enigmas of the history of the Nazi regime. Morell was not an unknown in Berlin when he met Hitler in 1936. He had a private clinic on Kurfürstendamm Avenue, where he treated industrialists, bankers, and artists. His fame was due to modern therapies that combined vitamin injections with glandular preparations and his own formulas, many of them bordering on quackery. What he offered was not orthodox science, but a package of quick solutions that delighted patients anxious to see immediate results. It was that quality, the ability to make one feel better instantly, that sealed his entry into Hitler's intimacy. From the first meeting, the dictator adopted him as his personal physician. Hitler suffered severe abdominal pain and chronic digestive problems. Morell administered a series of intestinal bacteria and tonics that produced immediate relief. From that moment, his position was assured. In Hitler's mind, Morell became the only one who had cured him when no one else could do it. That story, repeated again and again, justified his permanent presence in the Chancellery and in the command headquarters. However, the relationship generated tensions in the environment. Karl Brandt, the young and charismatic surgeon who acted as Hitler's escort physician, looked upon Morell with open disdain. He considered him a vulgar man, incapable of sustaining a scientific debate, and accused him of slowly intoxicating the Führer with his mysterious injections. Other doctors, such as Erwin Giesing, a specialist in otorhinolaryngology, agreed in pointing out that Morell exaggerated his diagnoses and used substances of dubious efficacy. Hitler's secretaries hated him for his careless appearance and his rude behavior at meals. Even Hermann Göring, an expert in ostentation, privately called him the greasy charlatan. Hitler himself was aware of the rejection that Morell generated. On one occasion, when someone commented on the doctor's body odor, he responded brusquely, "I do not employ him for his fragrance, but to take care of my health." That phrase, repeated among his intimates, marked the boundary. Whoever questioned Morell questioned the Führer's personal choice. That absolute protection explains why he was able to withstand the repeated attempts to remove him over the years. Morell's role extended far beyond medicine. He had direct and immediate access to Hitler at any time, something that very few could claim. While ministers and generals waited hours to be received, Morell could enter unannounced, armed with syringes and bottles. That privilege aroused suspicions. Some believed he was an instrument of manipulation, capable of altering the Führer's mood with calculated doses. Others thought he was simply an opportunist who had found in his most powerful patient a safe conduct for enrichment. What is certain is that Morell used his position to build a true commercial empire. He founded laboratories, registered patents, and promoted medications that he later advertised as approved by the Führer. Hitler's name became a silent brand that guaranteed massive sales. His company, Hammer AG, came to handle millionaire contracts, and it was not unusual that the substances he injected into his patient were also products he sought to impose on the pharmaceutical market. In this way, the dictator's body was transformed into a testing ground and at the same time into the best advertising endorsement. The mystery about the nature of the treatments was another element that fed the darkness around Morell. The notes in his medical agenda were full of enigmatic abbreviations: V for vitamins, G for glucose, M for indecipherable mixtures. Not even the other doctors of the inner circle could determine with certainty what many of those injections contained. When Joachim von Ribbentrop, Minister of Foreign Affairs, confronted him directly in 1943 and asked him if besides glucose he administered other substances, Morell limited himself to responding coldly, "I give him what he needs." That answer, ambiguous and arrogant, became his trademark. The isolation of the Führer reinforced Morell's power. Hitler, increasingly enclosed in his underground headquarters, saw less of the traditional doctors and trusted only the man who accompanied him daily. The relationship resembled that of an addict with his supplier. Each time a discomfort appeared, Morell offered an immediate solution in the form of an injection. The dictator, grateful for the momentary relief, defended him with greater vehemence. Thus was established a closed circle in which no one else could participate. The disdain toward Morell reached grotesque levels. His colleagues secretly called him the Reichsspritzenmeister, the master of the Reich syringes. The military aides considered him a ridiculous intruder who occupied a place that did not belong to him. It was even said that Eva Braun tolerated him only because Hitler needed him. However, his ability to survive all attempts at displacement made him a feared character. No one could risk confronting him openly without exposing themselves to the Führer's wrath. The relationship ended abruptly in April of 1945. When defeat was imminent and the Soviets advanced on Berlin, Hitler began to distrust even Morell. According to witnesses, he treated him coldly and even shouted at him to take off the SS doctor's uniform and return to his consulting room on Kurfürstendamm. It was the end of a relationship of almost a decade. The doctor who had been inseparable was expelled from the circle in the final days, as if the dictator wanted to break too late the chain of dependence that had tied him to him. Captured by the Americans after the surrender, Morell was interrogated at length. His memory was deteriorated and he barely remembered with precision the substances he had used. The interrogators noticed that he contradicted himself frequently and seemed confused, as if the years of excess had also taken their toll on his own body. He died in 1948 in a Bavarian hospital, alone, discredited and forgotten, never having fully revealed the secrets of his pharmaceutical cabinet. The darkness surrounding his figure lies in that contrast. A doctor detested and ridiculed by all, but at the same time indispensable. A man without academic prestige, but with the most privileged access to the most feared leader in Europe. His permanence alongside Hitler cannot be explained only by medicine, nor only by opportunism. It was the combination of both, added to the weakness of the patient, that made Morell an inseparable shadow of the history of the Third Reich. Disguised addictions. On the surface, Adolf Hitler firmly rejected any relationship with drugs. The propaganda of the Reich presented him as an abstemious leader. He did not drink alcohol, did not smoke, did not taste coffee nor tea. His body, according to that narrative, was a temple preserved from vices and excesses. However, the reality hidden behind the walls of the Chancellery was another. There, in the dimness of his office or in the intimacy of his room, bottles of pills and syringes with substances that kept him functioning accumulated. He was not a drug addict in the common sense of the term, but he was a man who had fallen into a web of disguised addictions, sustained under the appearance of medical treatments. The first signs came with the so-called anti-gas pills, conceived originally as protection against chemical attacks. These contained strychnine and atropine, two substances with potent effects on the nervous system. Hitler consumed them habitually, convinced that they helped his digestion and his general resistance. Strychnine in minimal doses could produce a sensation of stimulation. Atropine altered the heart rhythm and reduced secretions. What in theory was to be used in extreme situations became part of his daily regimen. With time, he began to request them insistently, as if he could not get through a meal without them. The next step was marked by nasal treatments with cocaine. Hitler suffered from chronic sinusitis and recurrent headaches. To relieve them, Theodor Morell applied solutions with small amounts of cocaine, taking advantage of its anesthetic properties. The effect was immediate. It cleared the airways and reduced the pain. But it also produced a fleeting sense of euphoria, an artificial state of well-being that Hitler found particularly pleasant. He did not become a classic cocaine addict, but he did develop an inclination to request it whenever discomfort appeared. The frontier between therapy and habit began to blur. The Vitamoltin Forte, one of Morell's creations, combined vitamins with animal extracts and, according to some researchers, may have contained stimulants in minor doses. After each injection, Hitler felt a rebirth of energy that contrasted with his usual exhaustion. The sensation of being able to rise from bed and continue working after an application generated a bond of psychological dependence. The Führer did not question the composition of what he received. He only valued the immediate relief and demanded it with increasing frequency. The addiction did not reside so much in the substance as in the certainty that without it he could not continue. The testimonies of his circle confirm that Hitler found pleasure in some side effects. The pills with strychnine and atropine, for example, produced in him a slight tingling that he interpreted as a sign of vitality. The nasal cocaine applications left him animated and with bright eyes. Even the sedatives administered to overcome insomnia generated an ambivalent relationship. He hated the excessive drowsiness they left him with, but at the same time he requested them because he feared facing another sleepless night. Each substance provoked an ambiguous effect that fed the circle of dependence. Hitler's obsessive character reinforced this process. He did not limit himself to accepting the doses that Morell prescribed. He demanded repetitions, discussed schedules, and requested adjustments. He measured the intervals between injections as if they were part of the daily strategy. He wanted to feel relief at the exact moment he needed it, and if he did not achieve it, he vented his fury on those around him. In practice, he had lost the ability to function without resorting to those chemical aids. His life was regulated by a succession of stimulants and depressants that Morell administered according to the occasion. The military observers noticed the difference. On occasions, Hitler entered a meeting pale, dejected, with a faint voice. A simple pause was enough for Morell to attend to him, and upon returning, he appeared revitalized with enough energy to speak for hours. Some officers even suspected that he was receiving amphetamines such as Pervitin, widely used among German troops to endure long marches. Although the medical diaries do not prove it directly, the possibility that it was present in some formulas fueled the myth that the Führer was sustained artificially by a cocktail of stimulants. Hitler himself acknowledged, in moments of sincerity, that he had created a habitual relationship with certain medicines. He admitted that the stomach pills were indispensable for him, that he could not sleep without chemical help, and that his daily performance depended on Morell's injections. Nevertheless, he vehemently denied being an addict. For him, addiction was associated with idleness, weakness, lack of discipline. His case, he claimed, was a medical necessity. The distinction was more semantic than real. In fact, he could not do without those substances. The paradox lay in the fact that the same man who had banned smoking in his presence and who prided himself on not drinking lived under a constant chemical regimen. His followers admired him as an example of physical purity, while he ingested compounds that in any other patient would have been marked as signs of dependence. That contradiction was carefully concealed by propaganda and by the inner circle, aware that revealing the truth would have weakened the image of the indestructible leader. The disguised addiction also had a component of secret pleasure. Hitler enjoyed the ritual of the injections, the gesture of rolling up his sleeve and feeling the needle penetrate. He believed that this act was the key to his resistance, a reminder that his body was receiving additional strength. Even when the effects were unpleasant, nausea, dizziness, sweating, he insisted on continuing because the immediate benefit outweighed the discomfort. Suffering, in his logic, was a test of discipline. The subsequent relief, a reward that confirmed his faith in Morell. The result was a figure marked by ambiguity. He was not a marginal drug addict, but neither was he a healthy man. He lived trapped in a network of substances that regulated his existence. Each day began with pills, was sustained with injections, and ended with sedatives. The addiction was disguised under medical language, protected by Morell's authority, and reinforced by Hitler's blind faith in his treatments. The patient that propaganda presented as an example of physical purity was, in reality, a man enslaved by a portable pharmacy. His dependence was hidden under the appearance of discipline, but the mechanism was the same as in any addiction: growing need, pleasure in repetition, inability to do without the stimulus. That was the true face of the disguised addictions that marked the Führer's last years. The visible deterioration in the war. The images of Adolf Hitler taken in the last years of the Third Reich show a man very different from the one who had captivated crowds in the decade of 1930. The leader who in Nuremberg presented himself upright, with energetic stride and fiery gaze, transformed during the war into a stooped figure with nervous gestures and a face furrowed by fatigue. That physical deterioration, which propaganda attempted to disguise, was evident to all those around him. Each military crisis coincided with a new ailment. Each defeat seemed engraved on his body as an indelible mark. The summer of 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, marked the beginning of a visible change. Hitler, who had assumed command with messianic enthusiasm, began to suffer severe intestinal problems. Diarrhea and dysentery forced him to remain long days in bed in the middle of the campaign. The diaries of Theodor Morell record weeks in which he could barely rise to receive his generals. While the front advanced toward Moscow, the Führer was weakened, with a pale face and an exhausted body. The photographs taken at the Wolfschanze show him thinner, with sunken eyes and a posture less firm than usual. The tension also accumulated in the nervous system. From 1,942 tremors began to appear in the left hand, initially discreet but increasingly noticeable. In meetings, he tried to hide them by resting his hand on his thigh or holding an object, but attentive observers perceived the constant vibration. In official films, that tremor was carefully edited or disguised, although fragments survived where it is undeniable. The gesture, apparently minor, conveyed the image of a sick man incapable of controlling his own body. The mood swings became more abrupt. Hitler could pass from an almost childish euphoria to a silent dejection in a matter of minutes. The doses of stimulants and sedatives he received kept him in a permanent chemical swing. During a conference with the High Command, recounted by officers present, he began to speak with exultation about the inevitable victory in the East. Minutes later, he fell into prolonged silence, with his gaze fixed on the floor and a distorted expression on his face. His generals interpreted those episodes as signs of extreme fatigue, but in reality they reflected a picture of physical and psychological deterioration that advanced without restraint. The cardiac deterioration also became visible. Hitler walked less and less, avoided climbing stairs, and preferred to remain seated during meetings. The stiffness in his walk, added to the tremor, gave him an aged appearance. In 1943, when he had not yet turned 55 years old, he seemed a much older man. The secretaries described him as pale, with yellowish skin and deep dark circles. The contrast with the images of the previous decade was striking. The leader who presented himself as an example of vitality was being consumed by a body that no longer responded. The hepatitis of 1944 worsened the situation. For weeks, his skin acquired a sallow tone, an unmistakable sign of hepatic inflammation. He lost weight and appeared weak, unable to sustain the long working days to which he was accustomed. In those months, prior to the Ardennes offensive, Morell redoubled the injections of tonics and vitamins to keep him active. The result was temporary relief, followed by even more pronounced relapses. Those who saw him daily recognized that the Führer was no longer the same. He walked with short steps, spoke with a faint voice, and seemed immersed in a fatigue impossible to conceal. The attack of the 20th of July of 1944 added a new layer of wear. Although he survived the explosion in the Wolf's Lair, the injuries were more serious than he publicly admitted. He suffered contusions, burns, and hearing problems that lasted for months. The blast affected his balance and his ability to hear in meetings. Propaganda showed him leaving the attack almost unharmed, shaking Mussolini's hand the next day. In private, he was in pain, with difficulty moving and under an even more intense regime of medications. His already fragile body had received a blow from which he never fully recovered. The deterioration became particularly visible in 1945. The films of those months, taken in the gardens of the Chancellery or in the Berlin bunker, show a stooped Hitler, with a haggard face and a faltering walk. Eyewitnesses spoke of an unrecognizable leader, incapable of sustaining long conversations, who needed to sit frequently and who depended on Morell to remain standing. His left hand trembled uncontrollably, and he often had to hide it behind his back so as not to betray his weakness. The war environment amplified that decay. While Berlin was bombed and the Reich collapsed, Hitler appeared in public less and less, aware that his image as an indestructible leader had been broken. Appearances at the front were limited to brief visits, carefully organized to avoid showing his deterioration. In one of his last filmed appearances, greeting children of the Hitler Youth in the courtyard of the Chancellery, he appears rigid, with mechanical movements and an almost absent expression. That scene, intended as a symbol of resistance, in reality conveyed the physical collapse of an exhausted man. The generals who accompanied him in the last conferences noticed increasingly alarming details: dry skin, cracked lips, lifeless eyes. Some, like Heinz Guderian, later wrote that he was in a deplorable physical state, unworthy of someone who had to command armies. Morell's clinical notes, although fragmentary, coincide with those impressions: hypertension, fatigue, recurring digestive problems, and episodes of dizziness that forced him to interrupt high-level meetings. The deterioration was not only physical, but also visible in gesture and posture. Hitler no longer sat upright. He slumped over the table, breathed with difficulty, and held his forehead as if trying to relieve a persistent pain. The movements that before were theatrical, the extended arms, the grandiloquent gestures, became clumsy and limited. The energy that had characterized his mass speeches was extinguished in short phrases, spoken with a hoarse voice. In the Berlin bunker, during the last months, the deterioration reached its peak. His subordinates often found him in a robe, unkempt, with greasy hair and neglected nails. The obsession with cleanliness and order, which he had cultivated in previous years, vanished. He spent long hours in silence, absorbed in thoughts that no one shared, and only regained some vitality after receiving a new dose from Morell. That image, repeated by several witnesses, synthesizes the end of his physical trajectory. A man artificially sustained, with a body worn down by illness, stress, and incessant use of substances. The visible deterioration in the war was therefore impossible to hide for those who were close. His generals, his secretaries, even his guards saw him transform into a premature old man, marked by tremors, fatigue, and a cadaverous appearance. What in the beginning had been a myth of indestructible strength gradually dissolved in the face of the evidence of a body that was collapsing before their eyes in parallel with the collapse of the regime he had built. Hitler's doctors' war. In Adolf Hitler's inner circle, doctors became figures as influential as generals or ministers. It was not only about keeping the Führer on his feet in the middle of the war, but about deciding what substances circulated through his veins, what diagnoses were communicated to him, and what treatments could influence his capacity to command. That situation inevitably led to clashes of egos, professional jealousy, and power struggles among those who treated him. The most evident conflict was the one that pitted Theodor Morell against Karl Brandt, although it was not the only one. Behind the closed doors of the Chancellery and the Wolf's Lair, a silent battle was fought for control of the most monitored body of the Third Reich. Karl Brandt, a young surgeon of impeccable bearing and a trusted member of Hitler's circle since 1934, had been appointed as escort physician. He accompanied him on trips, supervised the hygiene of his environment, and acted as guarantor of his health in emergencies. He enjoyed considerable prestige. Not only was he close to the Führer, but he also directed the euthanasia program Action T4, which made him an influential man within the Nazi hierarchy. The arrival of Morell, with his unorthodox methods and vulgar appearance, was for Brandt a personal and professional insult. The differences between the two were abysmal. Brandt represented classical surgical medicine, disciplined and meticulous, while Morell embodied improvised empiricism, mysterious injections, and experimental preparations. Brandt saw him as a charlatan who had managed to dupe Hitler and in private accused him of slow poisoning. Morell, for his part, despised what he called Brandt's academic rigidity and defended his own capacity to deliver immediate results. To the main rivalry were added other specialists who treated Hitler at specific moments. Erwin Giesing, an otolaryngologist, was summoned after the assassination attempt of the 20th of July of 1944 to treat the Führer's auditory injuries. His diagnosis was clear: he needed rest and conservative treatment. But Morell intervened, applying new injections that, according to him, would accelerate recovery. Giesing criticized him harshly, accusing him of aggravating the problems. The confrontation was so intense that on one occasion Hitler had to interrupt them, exasperated by the inability of his doctors to cooperate. Others, such as Karl Gebhardt or specialists in internal medicine, agreed in pointing out that Hitler was subjected to an excessive regimen of medications, many of them unnecessary, although none managed to displace Morell. The atmosphere became more tense from 1943 onward, when Hitler's state of health began to deteriorate visibly. Some general staff officers, alarmed by the tremors and fatigue, suspected that Morell was poisoning the Führer. In the corridors of the Wolf's Lair, it was whispered that that doctor could be an undercover agent or a dangerous incompetent. Brandt fed those suspicions with conviction. The climax came in 1944, when he dared to openly criticize Morell in Hitler's presence. The reaction was brutal. The Führer defended his personal doctor and reprimanded the surgeon. That episode sealed Brandt's fate, whose influence collapsed. What had been a privileged position became a marginal space within the circle of power. Hitler's isolation was reinforced by those conflicts. Increasingly distrustful, he reduced the circle of those who could attend to him. Only Morell retained constant access, while the others were relegated to specific and supervised interventions. That monopoly increased his power and heightened the frustration of the other specialists, who watched helplessly as the dictator sank into a state of chemical dependence without being able to intervene. Morell's figure became a recurring topic of conversation among high commanders. Goering ridiculed him, Goebbels despised him, and even Himmler suspected his methods, but all agreed that Hitler would never accept his dismissal. The medicine of the Reich was thus divided between the conventional professionals who warned of the risks and the only man in whom the Führer trusted, shielded by that absolute trust. After the collapse of the Third Reich, those tensions resurfaced in the Nuremberg trials. Karl Brandt was tried in the doctor's trial and sentenced to death for his responsibility in the euthanasia program. During the interrogations, he insisted that Morell had been the true chemical executioner of Hitler, although his words sounded more like personal revenge than objective testimony. Giesing recounted his quarrels with Morell and described the Führer as an obsessive hypochondriac. Morell, captured by the Americans, died shortly afterward in a Bavarian hospital without being tried, but his files were seized as evidence. Hitler's body, turned into an object of dispute, symbolizes the core of those confrontations. He was not a common patient. Each treatment had potential consequences on the course of the war. Morell's rivals watched in horror as a mediocre doctor had monopolized the leader's health while they were pushed aside. Each syringe applied consolidated his power, not only over Hitler's body, but also over the structure of the Nazi court. In that clash of diagnoses and in those struggles of prestige is reflected the silent battle of the doctors who, from the shadows, disputed dominion over the most feared dictator in Europe. The end of Morell. Theodor Morell, who for almost a decade had been the inseparable shadow of Adolf Hitler, ended his days in a contrast so brutal that it seemed an irony of history. He went from being the man with unlimited access to the Führer's body, the depository of his absolute trust, to becoming a forgotten pariah, accused of being a charlatan by his colleagues, despised by Nazi leaders, and abandoned to a physical decline that slowly consumed him. His end, marked by loneliness and illness, was as dark as his own trajectory. In the last months of 1945, when the Reich was collapsing and Berlin burned under Soviet bombs, the relationship between Hitler and Morell broke. For years he had resisted the attacks of generals, ministers, and rival doctors, always protected by the blind trust of his patient. But in April, when the Red troops surrounded the capital and the Chancellery became a besieged bunker, the Führer began to distrust even his faithful doctor. He looked at him coldly, no longer asked for his injections with the same urgency, and treated him brusquely. According to witnesses, he even shouted at him to take off the SS uniform and return to his private clinic in West Berlin. It was the first time that Hitler, in public and in front of his secretaries, expelled him from his side. The blow was devastating. For Morell, personal and professional identity was tied to his role as the Führer's doctor. Losing that position meant losing everything. However, he had no choice. He left the bunker before Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender. He walked out through Berlin's devastated streets, carrying only some documents and personal objects, without imagining that his destiny would be as humiliating as that of so many other leaders fallen in disgrace. Soon after, he was arrested by the American forces. The interrogators found him unkempt, sick, overweight to the point of hindering his movements, and with a bloated face from years of excess. They tried to obtain from him precise information about the treatments administered to Hitler, but Morell was a bundle of contradictions. His answers varied. He forgot dates, confused substances, and at times seemed not to understand the questions. The memory, once used to record in detail each injection, crumbled under the pressure of the interrogations. The Americans requisitioned his medical files and stored them as confidential material, aware that they contained clues about the health of the man who had provoked the war. The months of captivity revealed that Morell was not the self-assured doctor who had accompanied Hitler. He was a weakened man with serious circulatory problems, hypertension, and a deplorable general state. His former privileges had evaporated. He was no longer the Reichsspitzenmeister with the power to enter the dictator's office at any moment, but an obese and sick prisoner who depended on Allied guards for basic care. When he was finally released, he was not tried for war crimes. Unlike Brandt, condemned and executed in Nuremberg, Morell did not have upon him the direct shadow of criminal medical experiments nor responsibility in extermination programs. However, that did not mean he was free of guilt in the eyes of society. For public opinion, he was the doctor who had poisoned Hitler with an arsenal of substances, the grotesque man who had sustained the Führer while the Reich collapsed. The label of charlatan pursued him even in defeat. His physical state worsened rapidly. Without the protection of the regime and without patients willing to trust him, Morell found himself isolated, without income or prestige. He spent his last years in German hospitals and clinics, subjected to treatments for arteriosclerosis and circulatory problems. His contemporaries remembered him as a shadow of what he had been, swollen with livid skin and barely able to walk without help. He died in 1948 in a Bavarian hospital, practically forgotten by all, without close family to accompany him, and without ever having fully revealed the composition of his mysterious treatments. The end of Morell was also the confirmation of his historical ambiguity. For some, he had been an incompetent who slowly poisoned the dictator with useless remedies. For others, an opportunist who used Hitler's body as a testing ground and commercial platform for his laboratories. And there were those who interpreted him as a secondary but key character in the machinery of the Führer's physical and psychological decline. Whatever the perspective, the truth is that the doctor who had enjoyed unequaled power ended in nothing, reduced to just another patient on the long list of post-war sick, without prestige, without recognition, and with a life that was extinguished in darkness. The irony of fate was that the man who had spent years applying injections to another ended up as a chronic patient himself, incapable of sustaining himself without medical care. The one who once presented himself as the savior of the Führer ended as a wreck, dependent on nurses who tended to him without knowing, perhaps, that they were caring for Adolf Hitler's personal physician. In that tragic and grey end was concentrated the most brutal contrast, from the summit of power to absolute insignificance in barely 3 years, a fall as disastrous as that of his most famous patient. The history of Adolf Hitler cannot be understood solely through his speeches, the battles he directed, or the policies he imposed. There is a less visible but equally determining aspect hidden in the intimacy of his relationship with medicine and with those who had access to his body. For years, the public figure of the Führer was constructed as that of a man of iron will, endowed with inexhaustible energy, capable of enduring endless days without ever weakening. However, behind that facade was a chronic patient, prisoner of his ailments, who needed an arsenal of substances to sustain the image of invulnerability he projected. The medical documents, the diaries of Theodor Morell, and later testimonies reveal a portrait very different from that spread by Nazi propaganda. The dictator who proclaimed physical purity and absolute discipline was, in reality, a man afflicted by intestinal pain, insomnia, tremors, cardiac problems, and a growing dependence on experimental drugs. His body became a testing ground, manipulated by unorthodox treatments that kept him active in the short term while progressively weakening him. This contradiction between myth and reality is one of the most revealing aspects of his figure, the leader who presented himself as an example of strength embodied in his private life, the most common and desperate fragility. Morell's role was central in that story. A doctor despised by all but his patient, he became the guardian of the Führer's health and the administrator of the pharmacy that sustained him day after day. His permanence alongside Hitler cannot be explained only by the effectiveness of his treatments, but also by the psychological dependence he generated. Hitler convinced himself that only Morell could provide him relief, and that certainty blocked the way to any other doctor, even those with stronger training. The Nazi court was witness to that paradox. An obese and sweaty man, object of ridicule, occupied the most coveted and feared place of all, that of intimate advisor with direct access to the dictator. The consequences of that dependence went beyond the personal sphere. The Führer's health had an impact on strategic decisions and on the dynamics of power. His intestinal crises interrupted crucial meetings, his fatigue conditioned military campaigns, and his tremors were interpreted by his generals as signs of weakness. Even the attack of July of 1944, which left him injured, aggravated a picture of physical deterioration that was already evident. Hitler's body, sick and artificially sustained, influenced the course of the war as much as any political or military decision. The relationship between Hitler and his doctors also reflects the dimension of power that was at play around him. The conflicts between Morell and Brandt, the criticisms of other specialists, the suspicions of poisoning, and the intrigues that developed in the corridors of the Wolf's Lair show to what extent the dictator's body was a battlefield. Controlling his health meant controlling an essential aspect of the Reich. Medicine became a terrain of competition as fierce as politics, and in that terrain Morell prevailed thanks to the blind trust of his patient. The end of this story adds a layer of irony. Morell, who had been inseparable from the Führer, was expelled in the last days of April of 1945 and died shortly after in darkness, sick and discredited. His files, requisitioned by the Allies, remained as the most intimate testimony of Hitler's physical decline. In them appears the figure of Patient A, a pseudonym that crudely summarizes the contradiction. The man who dominated Europe was at the same time a clinical patient registered with cold letters in medical records as if he were any anonymous patient. The myth of Hitler as an indestructible leader shatters when observing that reality. He was a dictator sustained by syringes and pills, vulnerable to pains and nervous crises, incapable of sleeping without sedatives, needing stimulants to remain active. Propaganda concealed this side during the war, but the documents reveal that his body was as fragile as that of any common man. The final paradox is that the destiny of the Reich was, to a large extent, tied to the health of a patient who lived among rival doctors, experimental treatments, and hidden addictions. The history of Hitler and his doctors reminds us that behind the mythical figure, behind the absolute power and the machinery of terror, there was a sick organism, a worn body that needed constant care. That contrast between the public image and the intimate reality not only humanizes the dictator in his fragility, but also explains part of the dynamics of his regime and its final collapse. To understand that medical dimension is to understand another face of the tragedy of the 20th century, that of the man who believed himself indestructible and who, in truth, could not escape the ailments of his own body.